A book is not a movie, and a movie is not a book. And that's obvious to anyone that's read a book or watched a film. But for me, a first time writer, this is my first novel. And as I'm writing it, I'm seeing it almost as a movie in my mind's eye, which is lovely. It makes writing way easier. As I'm writing, I'm literally seeing each scene frame by frame, kind of like a movie. But the problem with that is that I'm writing it down like a movie. I'm creating a screenplay when really I should be creating a novel. And you might wonder, what are the differences between those, especially at the text level? Well, this is the most important one that I've found. When you're describing things, the first thing is to find the words. The word should be the voice of your protagonist or whoever your POV character is at the time. And what you're describing, I chose what to describe based on what would bring the reader into the fold and understand what the scene looked like. What I should have been doing is writing description based off what the character's attention is focused on and what the character's seeing as the emotionally important thing at the time. And I did that intuitively sometimes. Of course I did intuitively. I think anyone that's writing probably does it intuitively because you've got to describe things that are important to the plot at some point, and the character's emotions about those things should come out naturally. But especially early on in the novel, when you're setting the scene, or later in the novel, when you've got logistics chapters of travel or whatever's happening, you kind of you're a writer, so you just start writing. And as I've been rereading my manuscript, I've realized that all these scenes where I was just kind of writing and not fulfilling the character's emotional, vision, the scenes were flatter. The scenes didn't have any emotional impact. So a good example of this, the flip side of this, is in a movie. So in a movie like Ratatouille, you've got a character, Remy, the gutter rat that wants to be a chef. And in one frame or one 3-second shot, we see Remy looking through a window down at a Parisian kitchen, longingly, staring at the pots. The pots are glistening and it's pristine, and emulsions are being made and lovely bubbles of fat and steam swirling up, and it's beautiful. And we see the face of Remy longingly looking down at his profession that he can't do but that he longs to do. And we get all of that. We get his stakes, we get his emotional investment, we get his goals, we get everything encapsulated in that one scene. But if I were to write in a novel that scene, how would I get across that description? I couldn't just say Remy wanted to be a cook. I couldn't just say Remy wanted to be a cook and he stood there looking at the window. There was a kitchen full of people cooking. There was shiny pots and pans, like that still doesn't hit it. I would have to say a description of that scene through his eyes. And if it's first person, you're literally doing it through his eyes. And if it's third person, you're still writing the scene through his voice. But you'd have to say all those things, the glistening copper pots, and the romantic bubbles of fat, and, the aromas of meat, permeating through the old glass pane, and, when Remy's eyes watered, right? And that's what you'd have to show the exact same thing, to imbue the audience, the reader, with the same emotions. So this is kind of an essential part of writing that I did intuitively, like I said, but I left it out of a lot of places. So as I'm rereading the novel, I'm realizing that we've got to go back and do that. So what I did instead for most of my novel, when I wanted to bring the reader into the fold of how the character's feeling, I relied a lot on physicality, because I think that's what strikes me in books. I remember the shoulders pressed together, the wrap of a hug, the sunshine against the shoulders. Those are the moments of a novel that, books that I read that I latch onto. And that kind of builds the scene emotionally for me. And so that's what I do quite frequently. And I think it's a great tool, but there's a lot of chapters, or a lot of scenes I should say, where I have that physicality. I have some italicized thoughts, or maybe a character speaking to themselves, but then the description is kind of a flat, this is where we are, this is kind of a catalog of the furniture, and that connective tissue makes it weird. You get physicality, you get a character shivering in their apartment in New Hampshire where they're saving on the heating bill. But you don't get that. You don't get the saving on the heating bill. You get them shivering, and then you get a catalog of the furniture in their room, and then you get their monologue to themselves. And that catalog description just doesn't land. But the physicality does. So I don't want to not mention some of the tools that I already use to kind of create that emotion for a character. But what I am saying is that I think description through the lens of a character's emotion is going to completely transform a scene, way more than a little bit of physicality. And thoughts or dialogue to the character talking to themselves are great tools as well, but you can't use them all the time. And if you did, they kind of get flat. So I've got two examples. And the first one, this is a place where I did it instinctively and I looked back, and it's a very small example, but it shows Chase, our protagonist. We know earlier in the novel, in the prologue, we saw him sculpting at one of the best sculpting schools in the world in Italy. And it's now a year later, and he's working at a restaurant, an Italian restaurant in New Hampshire. And he's waiting tables. He's kind of exhausted. He's distracted. He obviously doesn't care too much for the job. This is what I wrote. He found his table's beer and wine waiting for him on the bar. The counter was cold, and the mineral veins in the black marble glinted at him. Chase hesitated, tilting his head to see the overhead lights ricochet off the small geometries in the rock. The bartender shot a glance at him, confused. "What's wrong? The red in the beer, right? That's what was on the ticket." "Sorry, just zoning out," Chase said quickly, hiding the marble with the cocktail tray and collecting his drinks. So that's like a quick scene where like we see Chase stop, focus on the marble. The bar, we've already established that the restaurant's busy on a Saturday night. There's lots of details to set the scene here, and we focus on Chase seeing exactly what he values, especially in the contrast of where he's now versus where he's been. He values the rock. He sees the details in the marble, and picking up beer and wine off a marble countertop, instead of focusing on the beer and wine that's the task at hand, he's seeing the geometries in the rock and the way the light shines off of it. And so it builds character, and it shows us a description of the bar, but in a very personal way for this character. Now, my second example is one that doesn't work. So the first one was one I intuitively made. The second example is for our other co-protagonist, Ashton. And Ashton is looking for Chase, our sculptor from the last scene. He's got information that Chase needs to know, and that's all I'll say. But he's searching for Chase, and he's in this town he's never been in, and part of his search has brought him to the local museum. And he's there, and he's in the great hall of the main museum, and he's describing the museum. He moved into the center of the main landing of the museum. There were short staircases on either end of the room with dark wooden railing. The walls were painted forest greens and deep plum. The ornate trim was dark wood as well. It wasn't unlike a pub, but on a grander scale. Now that describes the room. We see him looking at the whole, we see a room with dark colored walls, staircases on either side, and somewhat pub-like with dark wooden trim. That's kind of just a catalog of the room. And while I was reading that, I was even myself having a hard time imagining it because it's very basic. It's a catalog of the place. So I found this summary, and I rewrote it, obviously, because it needs a little bit of rewriting. So the revised version, allowing us to see something about Ashton, something about this town, something about the museum, something about Chase, we get to understand way more of the emotional landscape if we imbue the description with motivation and emotion. So here's the revision. The main hall of the museum was lit well enough by a skylight and sconces along the walls of the staircases, but the auxiliary rooms that seemed to house specific collections looked like caves in comparison. If there were sculptures in them, he might feel inclined to enter, if only to make sure Chase wasn't sat sketching in the dark. The attendant said that their sculpture collection was in storage at the moment, but these cloisters weren't unlike the nooks of the Roman cathedrals where he'd seen Chase sketching the statues of saints. Moving by the poky navy or plum or forest green rooms, Ashton peeked in, just in case. There's actual motivation. We see the rooms being darker. We see the main hall being lighter. There's contrast. We see him describe them as caves, and caves that he's willing to go into to find Chase. And we get a little bit of memory harkening back, and we see that the character of Ashton is one that compares memories and makes connections like that. And it all adds to a more rich scene that you can kind of sink your teeth into a little bit more. So we opened this video with talking about how a movie's not a novel and a novel's not a movie. And I think the way that we can describe things like this is a strength of a book that a film just has inherently. And if you're not imbuing everything with emotion and looking through the lens of whatever your main POV character is at the time, then you're falling short of where a movie can hit people. So emotionality, if that's a word in description, is very important. And that's what I'm learning to do deliberately more than just intuitively.